Picture a mountain in the dead of winter, the kind of cold that kills where you stand. And somewhere down in the valley below, a whole town has placed its bets, not on a horse, not on a card, on the day a girl will freeze to death. They counted her out the moment she arrived, 18 years old, cast out with $9, a dog, and nowhere on this earth to belong. They watched her climb up to a hole in the rock that even an outlaw had abandoned. And they shook their heads, and they waited for the snow to finish what the world had started. But high on that ridge, through the worst storm of the year, a thin ribbon of smoke is still rising, steady, stubborn, alive. And no one down in that valley can explain why. The gate closed behind her with a sound like a door shutting on a whole life. Not loud, not cruel, just final. A click of cold iron, a small gust of morning air, and then the long gray building behind her, the place that had held her since she was too young to remember being held anywhere else, became a place she could no longer walk into. The girl stood on the far side of that gate, and she did not turn around. She was 18 years old. Old enough, they had told her. Old enough to be someone else's burden now. Or no one's at all. In her hand was a small cloth sack that held the whole of what she owned. A second dress, worn thin at the elbows. A comb, missing some of its teeth. A folding knife with a good edge. And folded into a square of paper, pressed flat against her palm, were $9. 9. The woman who ran the home had counted them out the way a person counts seed grain in a lean and frightened year, slowly, as if each coin leaving her hand opened a small wound she would feel for days. "Make your own way," the woman had said. Her voice was flat as the surface of a frozen pond. "Or wither. The world keeps no room for soft hearts." And that was the whole of the farewell. No embrace, no blessing, no hand laid gently against a cheek, no promise, however small, that things might turn out well. Only $9, and a single sentence that would follow the girl down the road like a shadow she could not walk out from under. So she walked. At her side moved a dog, a lean shepherd, dark across the back and shoulders, with eyes the warm brown of creek water in the sun. His name was Scout, and he had belonged to her since the night someone left him in the cold to die. A shivering scrap of a thing, not yet old enough to open his eyes all the way. She had warmed him inside her own coat through one long winter. She had given him half of bread she could not spare, and he had not once, in all the seasons since, forgotten it. Now he walked where she walked. He stopped when she stopped. He pressed his shoulder against the side of her leg as they moved away from the gate, steady and warm, as if to say, "You are not as alone as you feel." She was, though, or near enough that the difference hardly mattered. The road bent down out of the high country, away from the gray building and the high stone hills, and at the bottom of a long green valley, it found a town. It was the kind of place a body could pass through in the space of a held breath. A short row of streets, a church with a steeple that leaned a little to the east, as if tired, a line of weathered storefronts whose paint had been scoured back to bare gray wood by too many hard seasons in a row. There was a name carved over the road where it came into the town: Redemption. The girl read it as she walked beneath the board, and something in her chest almost turned over into a laugh. redemption, as if a place could promise such a thing, just by carving the word above a road. She came into the town in the heavy gold heat of late summer, with road dust on her shoes and the dry smell of cut grass riding the air. The kind of warmth that fools a person, just for a little while, into forgetting that the cold is always on its way. The people of redemption noticed her the way still water notices a stone dropped into it. A ripple, a pause, a slow turning of heads. A woman sweeping her porch stopped in the middle of a stroke and let the broom go quiet. A man hauling sacks down off a wagon let his eyes ride along after the girl and her dog the whole length of the street. 2 children leaned out of a doorway to stare until an arm the girl could not see reached out and drew them firmly back inside. No one spoke to her. No one smiled. She felt the full weight of all those watching eyes settle on her shoulders, and she did the thing she had taught herself to do a long time ago inside the gray building behind her. She kept her chin level. She did not hurry her step. She let them look. Because a person who shows fear in a place like this gets swallowed whole. And the girl had decided, somewhere in the long quiet of her childhood, that she would not be swallowed by anyone. One face, though, was different. A small one. A girl no older than 6 or 7, peering out from behind a water barrel near the corner of a building. She had a smudge of flour on one cheek and a curiosity in her eyes that had not yet been taught to be afraid. She looked at the dog, and then she looked up at the girl, and she smiled, quick and shy, and gone again in a breath, the way a sparrow lands and lifts before a body can be sure it was there at all. It was a small thing, the smallest thing, but the girl carried it with her down the rest of that street, the way a person carries a coal cupped in their hands against the wind. She found the general store by the smell of it before she found it by sight. Coffee and leather and oiled wood and old dust, all braided together into something almost like comfort. A bell hung above the door, and it rang bright and careless as she stepped in, and every head inside the place turned toward the sound at once. 6 men, perhaps, gathered near a cold iron stove. Old men, most of them, the kind who have run themselves out of work to do, and so have made the watching of other folks' lives into a kind of labor all its own. At the center of them stood the man who owned the place. He was broad and gray and certain of himself down to the soles of his boots. His name was Walter Crane, and he wore his certainty the way a richer man might wear a fine wool coat. Openly, and with a quiet pride in the fit of it, he looked at the girl. He looked at the dog at her heel. He looked at the thin little sack hanging from her hand, and one corner of his mouth lifted, slow. "Help you, miss?" he asked. But it was not an offer of help. It was a weighing, a man putting a thing on a scale to see how little it came to. "Work," the girl said. Her voice was low, but it held steady. "Looking for work." A sound moved through the men by the stove. Not quite a laugh. Something smaller and meaner than a laugh. A thing that lives in the back of the throat. "Work," Crane said again, turning the word over as if it amused him. "And what is it you figure you can do?" "Whatever wants doing." He studied her then. The worn dress, the dust on her hem, the hard level set of a jaw far too young to have grown so hard. "There's laundry," he said at last. "There's mending. Maybe a back room behind the saloon you could sleep in, if the smell don't bother you. It was an offer of a kind, and the girl understood exactly what kind it was. It was a cage wearing a gentler name, another gray building, another set of walls, and another set of hands counting out small mercies, as if they were great gifts a body ought to weep for. 16 hours of labor in trade for a cot in a drafty corner, and the privilege of being grateful every single day for the cot. She had spent the whole of her life inside an arrangement just like that one. She did not want one more. "Thank you kindly," she said. "I'll think on it." And the not quite laugh moved through the men a second time. She turned to go, and that was when she heard it. One of the old men, his voice pitched low, meant for the others and not for her. But a person who has learned to listen in the long quiet of an institution, such a person hears almost everything. "Give her till the first snow," the man murmured. "Christmas, maybe, if she's a stubborn one." A second voice, drier. "I'll lay $1 on Christmas." And then Crane, soft, almost gentle, which somehow made it land harder than the others. "Don't waste the $1, Henry. There'll be no one left to collect it from, come spring." The girl's hand closed tight around the cloth sack. She did not turn around. She did not let a single one of them see her face. She walked out the door, and the bell rang bright above her, careless as a thing with no idea what it was ringing for. And she stepped back into the warm street with her dog at her heel and a small hard fire lit somewhere deep in her chest that she had no intention of letting them see. They were betting on her, on how long it would take her to die. And the worst of it, the very worst of it, was that not one of them was being cruel. They were only certain. They had looked at her, and they had seen a thing already finished, a small life already added up and counted and set off to the side as a sum not worth the keeping. She stopped in the middle of the dusty street, and she breathed, in and out. Scout pressed against her leg, steady as a fence post in a wind, and standing there in the dust, with the whole indifferent town moving around her, the girl made a decision that she would not hand them the ending they had already gone and written for her. She would write her own. She simply did not yet know how. The answer came, as answers sometimes do, out of the mouths of the very people who had counted her out. She did not go looking for it. She only listened. Over the next 2 days, she did small work for small coins. She hauled water from the well until her shoulders ached. She swept a porch for the price of a meal. She mended a torn saddle blanket for a farmer who paid her in bread and a wedge of hard cheese, and could not bring himself to meet her eyes while he did it. And everywhere she went, she listened. A name came to her in low voices, carried on the edges of other talk, the way smoke carries on the edge of a wind. Amos. She heard it at the well. She heard it near the churchyard fence. She heard it through the thin plank wall of the saloon late at night, while she sat outside in the dark with her back against the warm wood and her dog's head heavy across her knee. An old man, they said, a hermit. He lived up on the ridge that rose behind the town. A long, dark spine of stone the folk of redemption called Crowbone. He lived in a hole in the rock, they said, like an animal that had given up on the company of its own kind. He was wanted for something, they said, though no two of them could agree on what the something was. A killing, said one, with great confidence. "A theft," said another, with just as much. "A wrong done so far back that the wrong itself had been worn away by the years, and only the fear it left behind still lived on. And now," they said, "the old man was leaving, pulling up his roots, such as they were, and heading off for emptier country, where the law ran thin, and a man with a past could thin himself down into nothing and disappear, leaving the ridge, leaving the hole in the rock." The girl turned that over slowly in her mind, the way a hand turns a stone, feeling along it for the shape and the weight of the thing. A place to live, a place that belonged to no one, or that soon would. A place no living soul in that valley wanted, in a town where she herself was wanted even less. It was, when she let herself think on it, almost funny. The two of them, the outlaw and the orphan, the two souls in all of redemption that the good people of the town would be most glad to be rid of. Perhaps, she thought, they could be glad together. She found him behind the blacksmith's shop, in the long slant of a late afternoon, with the light gone the color of poured honey. He was older than the stories had made him sound. His face was a whole country of deep lines, carved out by sun and wind and the particular weather of a life lived hard and lived alone. He was loading a single mule with the slow care of a man who has learned, the bitter way, to carry only what he cannot do without. He heard her before he saw her. His hand drifted, easy and unhurried, toward the pistol that rode at his hip. Then he saw the girl, and the dog, and the hand went still. For a long moment he only looked at her, said nothing, took her measure the way the high country takes the measure of weather coming. She did not shrink from the looking. She had been looked at by hard people her whole life long, and she had outlasted every one of them. "You're the one they're whispering on," he said at last. His voice came rough, like a wheel turning over loose gravel. "The girl out of the home. You're the one they're afraid of," she answered. "The man up on the ridge." Something moved across his weathered face. Not a smile. Something older and slower than a smile. Something a smile grows out of in a kinder life. "What is it you want, girl?" "They say you're leaving." "Folks say a great many things." "They say you've got a shelter up on Crowbone." He stopped his work then. He turned, slow, and he looked at her fully for the first time, the way a person looks when they have decided a thing is worth the trouble of seeing clearly. He saw a girl. That much was plain. But he saw something underneath the girl that he had not been expecting to find. No softness in her, no begging, no trembling at the lip. Her eyes were level and dark and direct, and behind them sat a kind of stillness that most people 3 times over her years had searched their whole lives for and never once managed to hold. "It ain't a shelter," he said. "It's a crack in a mountain. The wind'll come down off the high country and cut you clean in half before the first hard freeze." "I have $9, the girl said, and she held out the folded square of paper with the worn bills tucked inside it. "Sell me your claim to it." A sound came up out of the old man's chest, dry, cracked clean down the middle. In a younger man, in a softer life, it might have grown all the way up into a laugh. He looked at the money. He looked at the dog standing quiet and watchful at her side. And he looked back at the girl, at the terrible calm she carried in her like still water in a deep well. And something in him seemed to understand all at once that she was not asking him for charity. She had no use in the world for charity. She was offering a trade, $9, for a thing no other soul on the green earth would put a single penny toward. "It's a hole in the ground," he said. "You'd freeze faster up there than you ever would in a ditch down here in the town." "A ditch is free," she answered. "I'd sooner pay for a thing that's mine." The old man went very, very quiet, because she had spoken the one word in the whole exchange that carried any weight at all. Mine. He had lived a long time. He had owned almost nothing, and he had lost the most of even that. And so he understood, far better than the comfortable folk down in the warm-windowed town ever could, what it meant for a person to hold one single thing in all the wide world that belonged to them and to no one else living. He tore a strip of paper from the back of a battered little ledger. He wetted the stub of a pencil against his lip, and in a slow, careful, deliberate hand, he wrote that he, Amos, gave over his place on the ridge called Crowbone to the girl, for the sum of $9. He signed his name beneath it. He held it out across the gap between them. She took it, and she pressed the $9 into his open, weathered palm. And here is the thing the town would have refused to believe, had any one of them stood in that honey-colored light and seen it with their own two eyes. The old man looked down at the money in his hand, and he counted out 3 of the dollars and pressed them gently back into hers. The girl looked up at him, and for the first time, the deep, still calm in her wavered, just barely, just at the very edges of it. "Why?" she said. It came out flat and low, and it was not quite a question. The old man folded her fingers closed over the 3 coins with his rough and gentle hand. He held them shut a moment longer than the doing of it called for. "Because the stone up there," he said, and his voice had dropped down low and gone strange, "is truer than the people down here." He let her hand go. "Keep that dog close to you," he said, and he nodded at Scout. "He'll be honest with you, come what comes. And honest is worth more than gold in this life, more than most folks ever learn." And then he turned away. He took up the lead of his mule, and he walked off down the long road out of redemption into the deep gold of the dying afternoon, and he did not look back at her, not one time. The girl stood and watched him go. She watched until he was a small dark figure against the bright and burning distance, and then until he was nothing at all but the memory of a shape against the sky. $3, warm in the cup of her hand. A scrap of paper that said a whole mountain belonged to her. It was not much. To anyone passing, to anyone watching from a window, it would have looked like the saddest little bargain ever struck under the sun. But to the girl, standing alone there in the last of the long summer light, it was the first thing in all her life that had ever truly been hers. The town heard about it by the following morning. A thing like that does not lie quiet for long in a place the size of Redemption. She went back into the general store to buy what little her small coins would stretch to. A shovel head with no handle, because the handle she could cut and fit for herself. A small hand axe, the edge dull but sound. A sack of coarse gray salt. And Walter Crane, standing behind his counter, looked down at the scrap of paper she set out to show what claim she held to the ridge, and he began to laugh. It was not a cruel laugh exactly. That was the strange and terrible part of it. It was worse than cruel. It was certain. You paid for that, he said, and he wiped at the corner of one eye. Child, you went and paid old Amos good money for that. $3 of it, she said, quiet. He gave the rest back to me. Then the old fool's a bigger fool than I ever took him for, or a softer one. Crane shook his head, still smiling wide. You've bought yourself a tombstone, girl. You've gone and bought your own grave and counted out cash for the honor of it. The men by the cold stove chuckled along with him, easy and sure. And the girl, she did not argue. That was the thing the whole town would come to remember later, when everything under heaven had changed. That she did not argue. Not one word. She did not beg them to believe in her. She did not swear she would prove them wrong. She did not weep, nor rage, nor stand in the middle of that store and plead her case before the cold and certain faces of men who had already buried her in their minds. She only gathered up her shovelhead and her small, dull axe and her sack of salt. She folded the scrap of paper away again, against her heart, where it was warm, and she looked at Walter Crane with those level, still, dark eyes, and she said one thing to him, and one thing only. "We'll see what the spring has to say." And she walked out. The bell rang bright above the door behind her, and Walter Crane stopped his laughing, though he could not have told a single living soul the reason why. The climb up Crowbone Ridge was steep, and it was long. The path was little more than a deer trail, winding up and across the broad face of the slope, switching back on itself again and again as the town dropped away below her into the deepening evening. The dog went on ahead, his nose down to the ground, reading the whole mountain in his own old wordless language. Now and again he circled back to her, as if to be certain she still followed, and then he ranged on ahead once more. The air changed as she climbed. It thinned. It cleaned itself. It shed the close smells of the town behind her, the wood smoke and the animals and the near press of people who did not want her there. And it took on instead the high, cold, ancient smell of bare stone and open sky. Her legs burned beneath her. The sack across her shoulder grew heavy, and then heavier still. Sweat traced a slow line down the small of her back. But she did not stop, because each single step took her one step farther from the gate that had closed at her back. From the woman who had counted out $9 as though it were a sentence handed down. From the men by the stove who had laid their easy bets on the day that she would die. And then the trail bent at last around a final shoulder of stone. And she saw it. She stopped. She set the heavy sack down in the dirt. And for a long moment, the girl simply stood and looked at the thing that was hers. It was not a cave, not truly. It was a great overhang of pale stone, scooped out of the side of the mountain across an age of wind and water and slow, patient time. A wide crescent of shelter, open to the south, where the long light of the day would come pouring in across the floor. High above, the rock curved over into a kind of ceiling, blackened in one far corner by the old fires of the man who had lived beneath it before her. The floor itself was a ruin, fallen rock, years of dead leaves, the scattered leavings of one man's long and solitary years. And at the very back, where the daylight did not reach, there was a darker opening yet, a true cave, narrow and breathing cold, receding away into the deep heart of the hill. It was, by any honest reckoning a body could make of it, exactly the thing Walter Crane had named it down in his warm and crowded store. A hole in a mountain, a grave sitting open and waiting. And yet, the girl stood there at the edge of it, in the last of the long gold light, with her dog beside her and $3 in her pocket, and the whole heavy, indifferent weight of a town's certainty pressing down across her shoulders like a yoke. And she did not see a grave. She tilted her head back. She watched the way the evening wind came up the face of the mountain and ran up and over the top of the great rock, and left the air beneath the overhang strangely, perfectly still. She crossed the uneven floor. She laid her bare palm flat against the back wall, where the sun had been striking warm all the long afternoon through. And she felt it, warmth, deep down in the body of the stone. A held thing, a kept thing. The whole long day of sunlight, gathered up into the rock and waiting there in the cooling dark. Her breath caught in her throat, because she understood all at once, in that single still moment, a thing that the wise and certain men down in the valley had never once stopped to so much as wonder at, that the mountain was not her enemy, that the stone could hold the warmth of the sun the way a banked fire holds an ember down through the whole long night, that nearly everything she would need to keep herself alive was already here, waiting for her, in the rock and in the wind and in the patient old bones of the place. She had only to learn how to listen to it. Scout came and stood beside her at the very lip of the overhang, and the two of them looked out together, over the long falling slope, over the small gray town in the valley far below, where the first lamps had begun to glow gold in the windows as the light went on out of the sky. Down there, they were already speaking of her in the past tense. Down there, they had counted her and added her up and set her aside. Up here, the wind moved soft and warm across the face of the stone. And a girl who owned one single thing in all the wide world stood at the edge of it and did not feel the cold that was coming. Not yet. But the cold was coming. It always does, in country as high and hard as that. The summer is a borrowed thing up there, lent out for one short season and called back in without mercy or warning. Already the light was dying earlier each evening. Already there was a thin edge to the air once the sun went down, a blade of what was on its way. She had a roof of stone, and a floor of ruin, and a black hole in the back of the mountain that breathed out cold. She had a shovel with no handle, a small dull axe, and a sack of salt. She had a dog, and $3, and a folded scrap of paper. And she had a winter coming down the mountain for her. A winter the whole of the town below had sworn, with money on it, that she would not live to see the far green side of. The girl knelt down at the edge of her shelter as the dark came on in earnest. She laid both her hands flat against the warm stone, and there in the gathering dusk, with the lamps of redemption glowing far below her like a scattered handful of dropped coins, she made the mountain a quiet promise that she would learn it, that she would earn it, that come the spring, when the snow drew back up the slopes and the town came climbing to find the frozen body, they were all so certain would be waiting, they would find something else instead. The wind moved soft over the high stone. The dog let out a long breath and lay down close against her side. And far below, in the warm and crowded valley, a man behind a store counter set down the cup he was holding, and stopped and frowned, and could not for the life of him say why. The first days she did almost nothing at all. To a body watching from the valley below, it would have looked like idleness, like a girl already beginning to give up. Sitting on a flat rock at the lip of the great stone overhang from the gray of first light until the gold went out of the evening, with a dog curled at her feet and her two hands lying still and open in her lap. But she was not idle. She was listening. She watched the way the sun came up over the far shoulder of the valley and crossed the open mouth of the shelter, slow as poured honey, laying its warmth across the floor and pressing it deep into the back wall of stone. She watched where the light fell first in the morning. She watched where it lingered last in the long gold of the evening. She marked the cold corners, the ones the sun did not reach all the day through. The places where the dark mouth of the true cave at the back breathed its steady, even chill out into the wider room. And she watched the wind. That, more than any of the rest of it, was the thing she gave her hours to. She tied a single thin thread of pale wool to the end of a stick, and she wedged the stick upright into a crack in the stone, and she sat for hours on end and studied the way that thread of wool moved in the air. It did not whip, and it did not tear, the way it did out on the open face of the slope, where the wind came down off the high country, with nothing to stop it. Up under the great curve of the rock, the thread only trembled. It drifted, soft. It lay still for long stretches at a time, hanging quiet as a thing in a closed room. The wind, she came slowly to understand, came down hard and cold off the heights, and it struck the wide body of the mountain that rose above the overhang, and it ran up and over the top of it, smooth, the way creek water runs up and over a stone in its bed. It passed above her. It passed around her. It did not, by some old patient grace in the way the rock had been shaped across an age of weather, come pouring straight in upon her. The wind goes over, she thought, not through. She took out a small, cheap notebook she had carried with her since the gray building, its paper cover gone soft and curled from the handling, and the worn-down stub of a pencil. And on the first clean page, she drew the shape of the overhang. She traced the path of the sun across it with a slow, curving line. She drew the way the wind came down and rode up and over the top. She made small, careful notes beside the drawing, in a hand far neater and surer than a body might expect from a girl who owned a single dress and a dog. She was not cleaning out a space. She was learning it. She was coming to know the bones of the place, its measure, and its stone, and its weather, the way another girl, in an easier life, might come to know the dear and familiar face of a friend. The work, when at last it began, very near broke her. The floor was the first of it. Years of fallen rock and dead leaves and the slow gray ruin of one man's long solitude lay heaped across the stone, and the whole of it had to be moved before anything could be built. She fit a stout branch into the handleless head of her shovel, and she lashed it tight with a length of cord, and she set to, bucket by bucket, load by load. She dug, and she scraped, and she carried, and she tipped each load over the long edge of the ledge, down into the falling dark of the slope below, where it scattered and was gone. Her hands, soft from a lifetime of folding linen and stirring kettles inside the gray building, came apart almost at the start of it. They blistered. The blisters swelled and tore and wept. By the close of each day, she could scarcely curl her stinging fingers around the cup she drank from. She tore strips from the hem of her second dress and wound them around her palms. And in the gray of the next morning, she rose, and she took up the shovel again. It went on like that for the better part of a week. The dog hunted while she worked, ranging out wide across the ridge and circling back with a rabbit, a squirrel, which she skinned and cleaned and cooked over a small open fire, eating the whole of it down, wasting not so much as a scrap. For a girl with $3 wastes nothing the mountain gives her. And slow, so slow she scarcely marked it happening. The torn skin of her hands began to heal over into something harder. The blisters became calluses. The soft girl from the gray building became, day upon day, load upon load, a person whose hands could grip cold stone and not flinch back from it. The ruin went over the edge. The bare floor came up beneath it, clean, level, waiting. And that, she knew, was only the beginning of the thing. There was a memory she carried with her. She did not take it out often. A body learns to fold such things away into a deep and quiet place, the way she had learned to fold away so much across the years. But there in the long labor of those days, with her hands buried in the cold stone and the wind running soft over the rock above her head, the memory rose up of its own accord, unbidden. A man's hands, larger than her own, scarred white across the knuckles, patient past the patience of most men. He had built things, the man in the memory, not in the gray building. Long before the gray building, in a time so far back now that it lived in her less as a picture and more as a kind of warmth, felt rather than seen, he had built crossings over water, spans of timber and stone set down across the places that would otherwise have stopped a person cold, so that folk might pass over and go on. And he had let a small girl sit beside him in the dirt while he worked. He had shown her how the weight of a heavy thing wants to travel down through itself to the ground, how a span holds itself up in the air not by being heavy, but by being shaped exactly right, how the warmth of a fire wants to climb, and where it wants to go when it climbs, and how a body with patience might coax that warmth to go instead where it was wanted. He had a way of speaking to her as though she were a person who could understand a thing, not a child to be hushed and sent off, not a small burden to be managed through the hours, a person sitting beside him, worth the telling. "You watch the thing first," he had said to her once, with his rough, warm hand resting easy on the top of her small head. "You watch it a good long while before you ever lift a single tool to it." Most folks are in too much of a hurry to sit and watch, and that, right there, that's the whole of their trouble. The memory ended the way it had a way of ending, in a cold that would not lift, a hard season that came down and settled in and refused to go. A thin-walled place that let the cold come seeping in through every gap and seam and crack, no matter how high the small fire was built against it. A man grown gray, and then quiet, and then quieter still, and then gone. In a season that should not have had the strength to take a man as strong as he had been. She had been very young, and after that had come the gray building, and the counting out of grain in lean years, and the woman with the voice flat as a frozen pond. But the man's hands had stayed with her through all of it, and his voice had stayed with her. You watch the thing first. You watch it a good long while. She had not climbed that mountain to lie down and die upon it. Whatever the town below was so settled and certain she had come up there to do. She had climbed it because of a promise, a quiet one, made to no living soul. made only to the cold itself, that she would not let it take her, the way it had reached out one hard winter and taken him, that somewhere in all the wide world there had to be a way for a body to stand warm against the worst that a season could send down, and that she, a girl with a dog and $3 and a hole in a mountain, would be the one to find it. Heat was the heart of the whole matter. She understood that much from the very start of it. A plain open fire, the kind the old man before her had warmed himself by, was a poor and a dangerous thing. The smoke of it would foul the air of the shelter and sting the eyes raw and red. The warmth of it would climb straight up and away, out from under the overhang and gone, given freely to the open sky, leaving the body sitting beside it, shivering, yet in the cold. She did not want a fire that warmed the sky. She wanted a fire that warmed the room. And for that, she needed far more than a simple ring of gathered stones. She needed a thing built with shape and with intention. A firebox set shallow and wide, its sides angled just so to throw its heat outward into the room instead of letting the warmth climb uselessly away. And a chimney, tall and straight and clean drawing, to carry the smoke up and out into the night and leave behind the warmth. She had seen such a thing once, in a drawing, in a book, in the gray building, in a long ago hour when a small girl had been left alone with a shelf of pages, a diagram of careful lines and small arrows, of heat and of air, and of the paths the both of them wanted to take when a body knew how to ask. And she had her father's hands living inside her own. And she had a whole mountain of stone to draw from. The creek at the foot of the ridge ran full of stones, round ones, flat ones, worn smooth and patient by the long, slow work of the moving water, and every single one of them, the girl soon came to learn, was a decision waiting to be made. Too round, and it would not hold a stack. Too heavy, and her arms could not carry it up the long, steep trail. She knelt at the edge of the cold water and turned them over in her healing hands and chose, one by careful one, the stones that would build her a machine for warmth. She made the trip 12 times a day, more than 12. A rough canvas sling thrown across one shoulder, her legs and her back straining low under the weight of the load, the dog ranging easy beside her on the trail, a silent and watchful companion who did not once complain of the climbing. She piled the chosen stones near the mouth of the shelter, and she sorted them there by size and by shape, the way another girl in a softer life might sort buttons or beads or the small bright treasures of a childhood she had not been given. And then she went looking for clay. She found it in a thick gray seam down in the earth near the creek, slick and cool and yielding to the touch. She dug it out with her bare hands and the worn edge of her shovel and carried it back up in a heavy bucket. She mixed it with sand from the creek bed, and with dry grass she shredded fine between her fingers, and she worked the whole of it together with her bare feet, kneading it the long way, the slow way, the way a body needs a heavy dough, until it had the right thick pull to it. No one had ever taught her the recipe of such a thing. She found it the way she had found most of what she knew, by instinct, by the feel of the earth and the water moving together in her hands, by some old knowing that lived down in her fingers, handed quietly down to her, by a man who had built crossings over rivers and let a small girl sit and watch him do it. She chose her spot against the western wall of the overhang, where the stone would catch the first warmth of the morning sun and stand sheltered from the soft drift of the wind. She laid down a heavy, flat slab for the foundation, level, sure, settled deep, and then slow, course upon patient course. The thing began to rise. She built the firebox shallow and wide, the way the drawing in the book had shown her, the way her father's voice told her still from the deep, quiet place where it lived on in her. The angled sides she set not by any measure or marked rule, but by eye, by the memory of those lines upon the page, by some sure sense in her of how the warmth would want to strike the angled stone and leap away off it, out into the waiting room. She was not merely laying up stones. She was building a machine for warmth out of a mountain and a memory, and the last quiet promise of a small girl made good. One evening, her hands shook too hard to lift another stone, so she set it down, and she sat. Far below her, the lamps of the town were coming on, one by one, gold in the windows of houses where people were waiting for one another, where supper was on a stove, where someone, somewhere down there, would notice if a chair stayed empty. She had no window yet. She had a dog. He came, and he pressed his head into her open, aching palm, and for a long moment she sat with her hand in his fur and let herself feel the whole weight of how far she was from everything. And then the weight passed, the way it does, and that, for now, was enough. After a while, she got back to her feet, and she picked up the next stone. The chimney was the hardest part of the whole of it. It had to climb high enough to clear the great curve of the overhang and pull itself a proper draft, and it had to stand. Through wind, through weather, through the long, hard grip of the season that was coming down the slopes toward her, it had to hold itself upright and not fall. She built it thick at the base and let it taper as it climbed, the way her father had shown her long ago, that a tall thing carries its own weight best when it is heavy at the foot and light at the crown. She packed the clay mortar into every joint and every crack and every seam, and she smoothed it down with her wet hands until the whole of it was sealed tight as a held breath in a cold room. It was slow work, painstaking work, the kind of work a body cannot hurry, no matter how the cold edge of each evening warns that the time left to do it in is running thin. From the valley below, a man out hunting late in the dimming day might catch sight of her up there. A small dark figure, moving back and forth along the high ridge, piling rock on rock, bending and lifting and setting and smoothing. It would have looked, from that far down, like a child's game, a fool's errand, a desperate girl playing in the mud and the stone, building nothing, building toward nothing, doing the small, busy, nothing work of someone who had not yet come to understand that the mountain had already won the game before she ever started it. They could not see the careful angles of the firebox. They could not see the true taper of the flue, nor the sealed and smoothed joints, nor the slow rising shape of a thing built to do one single thing, and to do that one thing well. They saw a girl playing in the mud, and they shook their heads down there in the warm and crowded valley, certain to the last man of just exactly how it all would end. When the building of it was done, she let the clay cure for 4 full days in the last good warmth of the autumn sun. And then, with a small and careful bundle of dry twigs, she lit the first fire. The smoke hung there a moment. It hesitated at the mouth of the firebox, the way a thing hesitates at the very edge of a choice. And the girl held her breath and watched it and did not move so much as a finger. And then it caught. It found the draft she had built for it. It gathered itself up and it rose, and it streamed up clean and straight and sure through the chimney. She had set stone by stone with her own ruined hands, and out into the cold, thin evening air above the ridge. No smoke filled the room. No sting came to her eyes, and a wave of warmth, deep and radiant and far greater than any open fire had a right to give, came rolling out from the angled stone of the firebox and washed over her where she knelt upon the swept floor. The dog, who had been watching from a careful distance, who had learned somewhere in his old life to mistrust the nearness of fire, lifted his head. He rose to his feet. He came closer, and he lay himself down upon the warm stone floor before the hearth, and he let out a long, low breath that seemed to empty him of some old worry, and the warmth sank down into his dark fur, and he closed his amber eyes. An animal does not lie about its comfort. The girl knelt there in the glow of that first fire, in the warmth of a thing she had built with her own two hands, hands ruined and healed and ruined again and healed harder. And she looked at her sleeping dog and at the clean ribbon of smoke rising straight and true into the gathering dark. And something moved across her face that had not moved there in a long, long while. It was not altogether a smile, but it was the nearest thing to one her face had shaped in a long, long while. The connection came on a quiet morning, and it came in the smallest of forms. She had gone out at first light to gather the last of the dry wood from the slope, the dog padding at her heel. And when she came back up the long trail to the shelter, she stopped short. There, on a flat stone near the very mouth of the overhang, a place a body could not reach without climbing the whole steep trail on purpose, with intention, with a reason, sat a loaf of bread, a small one, round and brown across the top, and still holding the faintest ghost of warmth from an oven somewhere far down in the valley below. And beside it, a small clutch of late wildflowers, the stubborn kind, the kind that go on blooming in the high cold places after the rest of the color has gone out of the year, tied off with a single thread of pale blue wool. The girl stood very, very still, and she looked at it. She looked at the bread. She looked at the flowers, and she felt a thing rise up in her chest that she had no good and ready name for, and did not altogether know what a person was meant to do with, because she could not bring to mind the last time a thing had been left for her that asked for nothing at all in return, no labor traded for it ahead of time, no mercy counted out grudging and slow into her open hand, no cot earned with 16 long hours of work and the daily duty of being grateful for the earning. Only bread, only flowers, only some small soul somewhere down below who had climbed a long and a difficult trail to leave a kindness on a cold stone, and had slipped away again without waiting to be seen or thanked. She knew well enough whose it was. She had seen the child once on the very day she first walked into the town, a small girl behind a water barrel near a corner with a smudge of flour upon one round cheek, who had looked up at the dog and then up at her and smiled, quick and shy, and gone again in a breath, the way a sparrow lights upon a fence rail and lifts off before a body can be sure it was ever truly there. The flower upon the cheek made sense now of the bread. The girl knelt down, slow, upon the cold stone. She took up the small loaf in her two calloused hands, and she held it, and the little warmth that was left in it passed up gently into her fingers. And she stayed there, kneeling, for a long while, longer than the simple doing of it called for. The dog came and pressed his shoulder against her side, the way he had his way of doing, and the two of them stayed there together at the mouth of the warm shelter, with the bread and the flowers, and the long valley falling away gold and quiet and far below them. A small thing, the smallest of things. But up there on that high cold ridge, where a girl had been left with nothing in her hands and counted out for dead, a small thing could be a whole entire world. Far below, down in the valley, a man on horseback had taken to watching the ridge. He had a star pinned to the breast of his coat, and a name the town spoke with a measure of respect, and a daughter of his own, near the age of the girl, up on the mountain. His name was Reed, and he had heard the easy talk in the general store, the same as everyone else had heard it, and he had told himself, the same as everyone, that it was a sad and a settled thing, a girl alone up on Crowbone, and there was no help in the world for it now. But a thing had begun to trouble him, the smoke. A man who has lived the whole of his life in hard high country learns to read a chimney the way he reads a coming sky, and the smoke that rose up off that high ridge was not the smoke of a desperate and a freezing soul. It was not the thick, dark, billowing, wasteful smoke of an open fire fed too high and too fast by frozen and frightened hands. It was a thin, clean ribbon, steady, even, rising straight and true into the cold air, hour upon hour, day upon day, without falter. It was the smoke of a fire that was drawing well, a fire that was under control, a fire that someone up there on that mountain knew, past any doubting, exactly what they were doing with. One gray afternoon, with the first true bite of the coming season riding sharp on the wind, he turned his horse and rode part way up the slope. He told himself it was to look in on a trap line. He knew, in the honest part of a man that does not lie even to itself, that it was nothing of the kind. He drew rein on a rise across from the shelter, where the thin, scattered trees let a man see without easily being seen, and he sat his horse, and he watched. He watched for the better part of an hour. He saw the low and careful lines of a thing being built with thought. He saw the clean, true draw of the smoke from a chimney a body had set with real intention. He saw the girl come out the once, moving with a quiet and an economical purpose about her, to gather clean snow from a high drift into a bucket. And he saw, plain as the cold light, that she did not move at all like a person who was cold. She did not hug her own thin arms against the wind. She did not hurry, shivering and bent, back into the dark of the shelter. She moved like a person who was warm, and the dog at her side. The dog did not pace, nor whine, nor huddle small against the stone. It lay there easy in the thin, pale sun, the way an animal lies down only when it has neither fear in it nor want. The sheriff sat his horse upon that cold rise, and he felt the hard certainty he had carried up out of the valley begin, very quietly, somewhere down deep, to crack. What he was looking at did not match the story the town had told, and told itself. It did not look like a tomb. It looked against the whole easy weight of the wisdom of the men gathered around the stove. Like a hearth, he turned his horse for home, and he said not a word to a single soul of where he had been, nor of what he had seen up there. But that same evening, when a man in the warm store asked him, half a laugh already in it, whether he meant to ride on up and fetch the body down before the snows came in earnest, and the wolves got to it ahead of him. The sheriff was quiet a long moment, and then he said, flat and low, 3 plain words that landed in the warm, crowded room like 3 stones dropped one by one into still and waiting water. The girl's alive. That was the whole of it. No more than that. No detail offered. No defense of her. No argument for her. Only the 3 plain words set down on the table there between them, and left lying. And the men gathered around the stove looked, slow, one to another, because it was not the answer they had been waiting on him to give. It was not the answer the story they had built called for. A small crack had opened, quiet, in the smooth and certain face of the thing the whole town had known for true, and up on the high ridge, in a shelter built of stone, and of memory, and of a dead man's patient hands, a girl sat warm beside a clean and steady fire, with a stranger's small kind loaf of bread, and a sleeping dog, and a notebook filled with careful columns of numbers. And she did not yet know that the valley far below her had begun, ever so faintly, to wonder. The last light went out of the sky. The fire glowed low and steady in the dark, and somewhere far down the slope, the first hard frost of the season crept silver and silent across the grass, and the cold that was coming for the mountain drew one long step nearer in the dark. The real winter did not come as a storm. It came as an occupation. It came down slow off the high country in the long dark of an early morning, and it settled over the valley the way an army settles over a country it has decided to keep. Quiet at the first of it, and then everywhere at once, in every corner, with no part of the land left untouched. The cold sank its teeth into the country and would not let go. It found every crack in a cabin wall down in the town, every gap in a chinked log, every small seam where the warm breath of a sleeping family met the cold breath of the dark, and turned by morning to a lace of frost upon the inside of the glass. The streets of redemption emptied out. The smoke that rose from the chimneys below grew thick and dark and desperate, fed too high by frightened hands, and still the cold pressed in. The firewood that had been stacked tall and proud in the gold of autumn began to dwindle down, and the dwindling frightened folk more, in the end, than the cold itself did. A man could see his own breath in his own front room. A child could wake in the deep of the night to find the edge of the blanket gone stiff against its cheek. The whole valley pulled its shoulders up against the season and bent its head low and waited for the cold to pass over and move on the way hard weather does. And the cold did not pass. It dug in. It stayed. Up on the high ridge, the cold came too. It came hard against the mountain. The wind howled down off the heights in the dark and struck the great body of rock that rose above the overhang and screamed across the top of it, a long, furious sound that went on through the night without rest. But the wind ran up, and the wind ran over, the way it had told her it would, on all those still autumn afternoons, when a girl had sat with her hands open in her lap and watched a single thread of pale wool tremble and drift and lie quiet. The low stone wall she had built across the front of the shelter broke the currents that ran along the ground and left a pocket of still air about the very mouth of her home. And inside, the slow patient laws of the cold stone had quietly become her allies. The fire in her carefully built firebox burned hot and even and true. It did not have to fight a single draft. The warmth of it struck the angled stone and leapt out into the room, and the great walls and the deep floor drank that warmth in across the long day and held it down deep. And when the fire burned low in the dead of the night, down to a soft red bed of embers, the stone gave the warmth back, slow, gentle, steady as a sleeping heartbeat. She had no need of a thermometer to know it. The dog told her. Her own breath told her. Soft and warm in the air, where down in the valley a person's breath was turning to frost on the inside of the glass. While the valley below shivered and burned through its woodpiles, the girl moved through her days with a quiet economy of motion. She fed the fire, but she did not feed it high. She ate the food she had gathered and dried and buried away in the cold cave at the back of the shelter. She mended what wanted mending, and she kept her notebook, and she watched the weather the way her father had taught her, long ago, to watch a thing before ever lifting a tool to it. And the dog was the truth of the whole of it. He did not huddle, desperate and shivering, against the hearth. He slept easy and long upon the warm stone, stretched out flat on his side at times, gone deep into some untroubled dream of running. There was no stress in him, and no cold. A dog has no reason to pretend. His easy breathing was the truest measure on the whole mountain. The girl had built herself a small and a stubborn warmth against the worst of the dark, and the dark, for all its patience, had not yet found a way through it. But the dark was patient, and the dark was not finished with the mountain yet. The storm came up on the 5th night of the deep cold. It rose out of the dark without much in the way of warning, the way the very worst of them do. The wind doubled, and then it doubled again. The snow that had drifted soft all through the evening began to drive sideways, thick and blinding, a moving white wall flung across the whole face of the mountain. The girl drew the canvas tight across her door and banked her fire down careful, and stood a while and listened to the storm throw the whole of itself against the rock above her. And far below her, down in the town, a small light went out into that storm, and did not come back. It was the child, the same small girl with the smudge of flour upon her cheek, the one who had looked up at a dog and a stranger on a dusty summer street and smiled the quick, shy smile of a sparrow lifting off a rail, the one who had climbed a long, hard trail in the gentler days to leave a loaf of bread and a clutch of flowers tied with pale blue wool upon a cold stone, and had slipped away again down the mountain without once waiting to be thanked. No one could say, after, exactly how the thing had happened. A door left poorly latched against the shoving of the wind. A small heart, full up with some notion the grown folk could not follow nor guess at. A child who had taken it into her head, perhaps, to carry one more small kindness up the mountain before the snow came, and shut the trail away for the whole of the season. By the time her mother turned from the stove and found the little coat gone from its peg by the door, the storm had already swallowed the trail whole. The town woke to the cry of it going up. Lanterns came out into the white, bobbing and small, swallowed near the very moment they left the safety of the doorways. Men called the child's name out into a wind that tore the name straight from their mouths and flung it away into the roaring nothing. They searched the low streets, they searched the barns, and the lee of the church, and the hard frozen length of the creek. They did not search the mountain. A body did not go up the mountain in a storm the like of that one. To go up was to be lost as surely and as quickly as the child was lost. The men gathered at the foot of the trail with their lanterns guttering low in the wind, and they looked up into the howling white above them, and not a one of them could make himself take the first step into it. And one man, half out of his mind with the cold and the fear, remembered the smoke. The father. He remembered the thin, clean ribbon that rose from the high ridge, steady even in the teeth of the wind. He remembered that someone lived up there. Someone who knew that mountain in a way no soul in the valley did. Someone the whole town had counted out for dead by Christmas, and who had not, against the full weight of all their certainty, died. He could not have told a soul what he hoped to find up there. He only knew that his child was somewhere on that mountain in the dark. And so, while the other men stood frozen at the foot of the trail, he climbed. The girl heard the knock through the roar of the storm. It was a small sound set against so vast a noise. A fist, frozen near to senseless, striking the wooden frame of her doorway. She might have missed it altogether. The dog did not. His head came up off the warm stone, his ears gone sharp, and he was up on his feet and at the canvas before she had so much as risen from her low stool. She crossed and pulled the flap aside, and the wind tried to come pouring in, and could not, broken by the low wall and the still pocket of air she had made. And what came in instead of the wind was a man. He fell more than he stepped across the threshold. His coat was crusted hard and white. His face was raw and gray and wrong somehow. The face of a man who has walked clean past the far edge of what a body is built to bear. For a long moment he could not speak at all. His mouth worked, and no sound came. And then the warmth reached him. It reached through the frozen shell of his coat, and went down into him, deep and sudden. And it seemed to wake some last thing in him, and the first word he found was not a word of greeting, nor of asking. It was his daughter's name. He said it the once, cracked clean down the middle of it. And then the whole story came out of him in a single broken rush. The door left open, the empty peg, the small coat gone, the men below who could not climb, the storm that had reached out of the dark and taken her. And his eyes, when at last he lifted them to the girl's face, held nothing in them at all but a drowning man's last blind reach for something to hold. "She's on the mountain," he said. "My girl. She's up here somewhere. Out in this." The girl had gone very still. She was not looking at him. She was looking past him, out through the open canvas at the moving wall of driving white. And in her face there was not one trace of the panic that filled his own to the brim. There was something else. She was thinking. The man saw it and did not understand it, and the not understanding near broke what was left of him. "There's no time," he said. "Please, there's no time for—" "Where did the trail take her?" the girl said. Quiet, even, not quite to him, to herself more. If she came up, if she meant to climb up here. She crossed the swept floor to the mouth of the shelter and stood at the low stone wall and looked out into the storm. And she did not see white chaos the way the man behind her saw it. She saw the mountain. The mountain she had sat and watched across the whole long autumn. She saw the way the wind came down off the heights and the way it struck the body of the rock and split and turned. She saw where it drove the snow before it and how hard and where, in the lee of certain shoulders of stone, it lost its strength and laid the snow down soft and deep, the way a creek lays down its silt in the slack water behind a rock. A small thing, lost and tiring and cold, would not fight that wind. A small thing would go where the wind pushed it, down and across, toward the low and sheltered places, toward the slack water of the mountain, where the drifts gathered deep and soft and terribly quiet. She knew where the wind pushed things. She had watched it push things, leaf and branch and snow, the whole season through. There's a fold in the slope, she said, below the third bend, where the wind sets down what it carries. She was already moving as she spoke it, already reaching for the heavy coat she had pieced together from canvas and scrap and wool, already winding the strips of cloth around her hands. If she started up the trail and the storm turned her around, that's where it would have carried her. Down to the slack water. The father stared at her. You can't go out into that. No one can go out into... You stay, the girl said. And there was a thing in the two plain words that stopped the man cold. You're done in, she said, gentler now, but no less sure for the gentleness. You go back out into that, and I'll be carrying two of you home. Sit by the fire. Get the warmth down into you. There'll be a child to thaw when I come back, and she'll be needing her father able to hold her. When I come back, not if. She said it the way she said the things that mattered most to her. Flat, plain, certain. A fact set down upon the table between them and left there to stand on its own. And the man, who had climbed a mountain in a killing storm on nothing in the world but a father's blind and stubborn hope, looked at this girl that the whole town had buried alive in its mind, and he sat down by her fire, and he let her go. She went out into the white with her dog at her side. The wind took her the moment she cleared the low wall. It was a living thing, that wind. A great hand that shoved and clawed and tried to peel the warmth straight off her body and fling it away. The cold was past cold. It had become a pressure, a weight bearing down, a thing with a will of its own that wanted, more than anything, to get in. She did not fight it head on. She had not built the whole of her survival on fighting things head on. She had built it on understanding them. She went with the shape of the mountain instead. Down along the line she had walked 100 times for water and for wood. The line her feet knew even now, with the snow erasing every familiar mark of it. The dog ranged out ahead of her, a dark shape that came and went and came again in the driving white, his nose held low, reading what the storm had not yet managed to bury. The third bend, the fold in the slope below it, where the wind grew tired and dropped its load, and the drifts lay deep and soft. She went toward the slack water of the mountain, and she called the child's name as she went, not into the wind, the way the men far below had thrown it and lost it. Across the wind, low and steady, into the lee places, where a small sound might still carry a little way, and a small cold ear might still catch it. The storm answered her only with more of the storm. She climbed down and across, falling at times to her knees in the deep of it, and rising, and going on. The cold reached into her chest and closed a hand around her breath, and she breathed past it, and went on. She did not let herself think of the long climb back. She thought only of the next step, and the next, and the dark shape of the dog ahead of her in the white. And then the dog stopped. He stood stiff in a drift below the third bend, his whole body gone rigid, pointed like a drawn arrow at a low, soft swell of snow heaped against the base of a stone shoulder. He looked back at her, the once, and then he began, hard and fast, to dig. The girl came down through the drift toward him, falling, rising, falling again, and dropped to her knees beside him, and dug with her wrapped and frozen hands alongside his. And there, in the soft pooled snow of the slack water of the mountain, in the exact place where the wind had told her a small lost thing would come at last to rest, she found the child, curled small, the little coat crusted over hard and white, the small face pale and still, and so dreadfully cold. But there, whole, found. And when the girl pulled her up and out of the smothering snow and pressed her ear down against the small chest, beneath the howl of the wind, faint, so faint, faint as the last held warmth in a loaf of bread buried deep in a cold cave, there was a heartbeat. The way back up the mountain was the longest distance in all the world. The girl carried the child held against her own chest, tucked inside her coat, the small frozen weight of her pressed to whatever warmth the body had left to give. The wind came at her back now, shoving her up the slope, and that small mercy was the only one the storm saw fit to allow her. The dog led the way home. He did not range now. He stayed in close, a dark and certain shape just ahead of her in the white, the one fixed and steady point in a whole world gone to roaring chaos. And she followed him the way a lost ship follows the one light it can find. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she found them again. The cold reached deeper into her chest and squeezed harder, and she breathed past it once more, and climbed. And she talked to the child as she climbed, low, steady, unhurried even now, the way her own father had once talked to her, long ago, as though she were a person who could understand a thing. Stay with me now. We're almost home. You stay right here with me. You hear me? Almost there. The words were likely lost in the wind the moment she spoke them. The words were not, perhaps, altogether the point of the saying of them. And then the low stone wall rose up out of the white in front of her, and the canvas, and the dark, warm mouth of the shelter behind it, with the firelight glowing low and gold within, and a man's shape surging up out of that warmth, reaching, weeping, taking the small frozen weight of his daughter out of the girl's arms with a sound that was past all words. The girl came in behind them and let the heavy canvas fall, and the storm was shut outside in the dark where it belonged. The night that came after was a long one. The girl did not panic, and she did not waste a single motion, and she did not allow the father's terror to become the thing that ran the room. She had warmed a near-frozen body before. She had warmed a half-dead pup inside her own coat through a hard winter, a long time gone. She knew, deep in her hands, that the cold could not be chased out fast. that to rush it was to do real harm to a body. The cold had to be coaxed out, drawn slow, the way the warmth itself was drawn slow and patient out of the heart of the stone. She took the smooth, flat stones that lay always along the edge of her hearth, soaking up the radiant heat through the long days. She tested each one with a knowing hand. She wrapped them in scrap wool and set them careful and close along the small, still body, at the feet, beside the chest, not against the bare skin, not too fast, not ever too fast. She built the fire up, but not high, steady. She had the father hold the child against his own body, beneath the blankets, his warmth and the warmth of the wrapped stones and the warmth of the deep, patient room, all working together at the one slow task. She made a tea of the dried herbs she had gathered off the mountainside through the autumn and hung in bundles from the shelf carved into the rock. And when at last the child stirred and swallowed, she got a few warm drops of it past the small pale lips. And the warmth of the shelter, the impossible, stubborn, hard-won warmth of a hole in a mountain that a whole town had named a grave and a tombstone and the saddest bargain ever struck, wrapped itself slow around that small flickering life and held it close and would not let the dark have it. The violent shivering eased and then it stilled. The dreadful gray went out of the small face by degrees, and a faint, living color crept its way back in. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, the child's eyes came open, cloudy at the first, lost. And then they found her father's face hung above her in the firelight, and the small hand came up out of the blankets and closed itself around one of his fingers, and held on. And the father who had climbed a mountain in a killing storm, who had sat helpless and shaking by a stranger's fire, while a girl he had never once thanked went out alone into the dark for his child. The father put his face down against his daughter's hair, and his shoulders shook. And he wept the way a man weeps when the very worst thing in the world reaches out its hand for the one thing he loves most, and then, at the last, draws its hand back. The girl watched from beside her fire, with her dog leaned warm and heavy against her side, and she said not a word. She had given what she had to give. The rest of it was the child's own to do, and the child was doing it. There came another knock at the door before the dawn. The storm had broken by then. The wind had fallen away to a tired and fitful murmur, and the world outside had gone to that deep blue stillness that comes only after the worst of a thing has spent the whole of itself and has nothing left. The girl rose and crossed the floor and drew back the canvas, and there, crusted white and breathing hard from the long climb, stood the broad gray shape of the man who had laughed at her across the counter of his warm store. Walter Crane. He had come up with the breaking of the storm, 2 other men behind him with lanterns in their fists. Word had reached the town at the last that the father had gone up the mountain, that the child had been lost upon the ridge, that whatever was up there now, the both of them had become part of it. He had climbed, it may be, to help carry a body back down. He had climbed, it may be, to lay the blame for the whole black night squarely at the feet of the strange girl who lived where no sensible soul was meant to live. The girl who drew children up dangerous trails, the way he would tell it, with her bread and her smoke and her foolishness. He had a great many words in him, did Walter Crane. He had spent the better part of the autumn spending them on her. He stepped across the threshold, ready and loaded to spend a great many more, and the warmth stopped him where he stood. It reached through his frozen coat the way it had reached through the father's, deep and sudden and past all argument. And Walter Crane, who had named this very place a tombstone by a warm stove, who had counted out a girl's death with good money laid against it, stood stock still in the middle of a warmth he had no way under heaven to explain. His eyes moved slow about the room, the clean-drawing fire, the angled stone of the firebox, glowing, radiant, near alive with held heat, the neat shelves carved straight into the rock, the herbs hung in their careful tied bundles, a place more ordered and more cared for, and far warmer than his own fine house down in the valley below. And there, in the gold of the firelight, wrapped in blankets, with the warm wrapped stones set close along her small body, and her father's arms folded around her, and a faint and living color come back into her cheeks, the child, breathing, alive. The two men behind Crane crowded into the doorway and went silent. The lanterns guttered low. No one in that warm room spoke a word, and the words that Walter Crane had carried all the long way up the mountain, the whole heavy load of them, the blame and the scorn and the easy certainty he had worn the entire season through, like a fine and well-fitted coat, died in his throat. He looked at the fire. He looked at the living, breathing child. He looked at the last, at the girl, who stood quiet by her own hearth, with her dog at her side and her hands still wrapped in the torn strips of her own thin dress, and who looked back at him out of those level, dark, untroubled eyes, and asked him for nothing at all. Not an apology, not a single word of the many he had spent on her. Nothing. He opened his mouth, and he found that he had, for the first time in a long, long memory, nothing in the world left to say. There came one more shape up the mountain that night after the storm had stilled and the worst of it was past. Quiet, unhurried, a figure leading a tired mule up the last steep turns of the trail, as though the killing storm just spent had been no more than a hard spring rain to be waited out in the lee of a tree. The old man, Amos. He had not gone so far out into the empty country as the town had supposed, or he had gone, and somewhere out there a thing had turned him around and brought him back. He did not say which of the two it was, and the girl did not ask it of him. He only came up out of the deep blue dark and stood at the low stone wall and looked in through the open canvas at the warm and crowded room. He saw the fire he himself had never once thought to build. In all his solitary years beneath that rock, he saw the careful order a girl had made of his old hole in the mountain. He saw the men crowded in the doorway with their dead lanterns and their wide open faces. He saw the saved child in the firelight. He saw Walter Crane standing silent in the middle of it all, with nothing left in him to say. And the old man's weathered face did a thing that, in a younger man, might almost have been the start of a smile. He did not come in to take charge of any of it. He did not step forward to explain her, or to defend her, or to turn the long night somehow about himself. He had given her the mountain, and the mountain was hers now. and what she had built upon it with her own 2 hands was hers. And he understood that perhaps better than any other soul living, he only came and stood where she might see him, a steady, quiet shape at the very edge of the firelight, so that the girl, glancing up from her hearth in the long, strange hour before the dawn, with the whole town's certainty crumbling away to nothing in her own doorway, would know the one thing, that she did not stand in the middle of it alone. The girl met the old man's eyes across the warm and crowded room. Neither one of them spoke. There was no need in it. And then she turned back to her fire, and she fed it one more careful log, and she watched the small, clean flame take hold and rise, while outside the long blue dark began, at its far and distant edge, to gray slow toward the morning. Down in the valley, when the full light finally came, the men who had stood in her doorway through that hour would carry what they had seen back down into the town, and they would find they did not have the right words for it, and so they would tell it plain, the way plain folk tell a thing too large for them, that the girl went out into the storm when no other soul would set a foot in it, that she came back up out of the dark with the child in her arms, that the cold did not get past her stone and her fire, that the hole in the mountain they had every one of them called a grave had kept a dying child alive through the worst night of the whole hard year. And Walter Crane, who climbed back down that mountain at the first gray of dawn with the silence still sitting heavy and strange inside him, would walk into his own warm store and stand a long moment before the small chalkboard near the stove, the one where, in the easy gold of an autumn that felt now like another life, certain comfortable men had chalked up their bets on the day a girl would freeze. He would stand there, and he would look at it, and without a word to a single living soul, he would take up a rag and wipe the whole of it clean. He would not say that he was sorry. A man of that kind does not always have the words in him for it, but a clean board where the cruel words had been, that too is a way of saying a thing. And up on the high ridge, in the pale gray of the new morning, a girl who had been turned out into the world with nothing in her 2 hands stood at the mouth of a warm shelter she had built with those same 2 hands, and looked down upon a valley that had begun, at the long last, to see her. The cold was not done with the land. The winter would keep its grip a good while longer yet, but something had turned deep in the dark of that long night, something that the cold, for all of its terrible patience, did not have the power to freeze. And the thin, clean ribbon of smoke rose up steady from the high stone chimney into the still and brightening air, the way it had risen all along, for anyone down in the valley below who, at the long last, had found the eyes to look up and to read it. The great cold broke at the last, the way such things do, not all at once, but in a slow turning. The wind that had screamed down off the heights for so many nights softened one evening into something almost gentle. The deep, killing chill let go its grip on the land, finger by finger, and one gray morning, a body standing at the mouth of the high shelter could hear, beneath the stillness, a new sound. Water. The slow, secret drip of snow beginning to let go of the rock. The thaw came up the valley like a thing too long held back. The drifts grew soft and gray, and then they sank. The frozen creek groaned and cracked and began again to run. The streets of the town below turned from iron to thick brown mud, And the people of redemption, who had pulled their shoulders up against the dark for so long, lifted their heads at last and felt the change of it in the air. Spring did not come gently to that country. It came as a mess, a necessary, muddy, dripping thaw. But it came, and with it came a change in the way the valley looked up at Crowbone Ridge. It began with small things. It began the way the deepest changes in folk most often do, not with grand words spoken from a church step, but with quiet hands doing quiet things in the early light when no one is meant to be watching. One morning, the girl came out at first light and found, stacked neat against the low stone wall, an armload of split, dry firewood. Good wood, seasoned. The kind a body sets aside in autumn for the hardest part of the winter, and parts with only at some cost to themselves. There was no note left with it. There was no name. Whoever had carried it up the long trail in the dark before the dawn had set it down, and turned, and gone back down again without waiting to be seen or thanked. The girl stood and looked at the wood a long while, and she thought of a small loaf of bread left once on a cold stone in the same quiet way. She carried the wood inside, and she stacked it by her hearth, and she said nothing of it to anyone. A few mornings on, there was something else. Down at the foot of the trail, where the deer path began its long, steep climb up the face of the ridge, someone had set down a single plank of milled wood, flat, sturdy, laid across the worst of the mud at the bottom, where a body's boots slid out from under them on the climb. The first plank. It was a small thing, a scrap of lumber across a muddy patch. A person could pass it by without a second look and think nothing of it. But the girl, coming down for water, stopped when she saw it, because she understood what a plank like that one was. It was the beginning of a path. A path is not a thing a body builds toward a grave. A path is a thing a body builds toward a place they mean to return to. They came up the mountain after that, in ones and twos. Not the way the father had come, frantic in the dark. Not the way Walter Crane had come, loaded with words he meant to spend. They came in the soft gray light of ordinary mornings, in the muddy gold of ordinary afternoons. And they did not come bearing baskets of charity, the way folk had once spoken of doing, back when they had pitied her and counted her dead. They came bearing questions. A farmer was among the first of them, a heavy, weathered man who had lost the better part of his flock that winter to a barn that the cold had gone straight through, as though the walls were not even there. He climbed the long trail, and he stood for the best part of an hour at the low stone wall the girl had built across the front of her shelter. He did not say much. He ran one big, rough hand along the dry, stacked stones. He felt where they fit, one against the next, with no mortar between them, holding by nothing but their own careful weight and placement. No mortar, he said at last, mostly to himself. He sounded near to wonder. And it still turns the wind. The girl did not lecture him. She did not stand and explain to him the way the weight of a stone wants to settle, nor the way a wall set just so will break a wind without a single nail or a drop of clay to hold it. She had no taste for lecturing, and the man had no need of being lectured. She only let him look. She let him run his hand along the wall, and crouch low to see how the lowest stones were set, and stand and study the whole of it with the slow attention of a man who has just understood that the thing he took for a fool's game was, the whole time, a thing built by someone who knew exactly what she was about. When he climbed back down, He did not climb down empty. He carried in his head the shape of a wall that turned the wind. Two brothers came up next. They owned the little mill down in the valley, and they had a builder's eye between them, and they went straight to the chimney. They tapped at the clay mortar with their knuckles. They peered up the line of the flue. They stood beneath it and felt the way the air moved, drawn clean and steady, up and out. "It draws true," one of them said, and there was a kind of respect in it. "No smoke backing into the room. None at all." He shook his head slow. "I've built better-looking chimneys than this in my life. I'm not sure I've built a better one." They asked her, then, about the clay, where she had found it, how she had mixed it, what she had added, and in what measure. And the girl who had spent the whole of her life being talked down to, being counted out, being handed small mercies as though they were great gifts, the girl answered them. She did not boast, and she did not hold the knowing back. She told them where the gray seam of clay ran near the creek. She showed them, with her hands, how she had worked the sand and the grass into it. She walked them to the firebox, and showed them how the angled stone threw the heat out into the room instead of letting it climb away and be lost. She had built it all alone, in the silence, with no soul to tell it to. And now there were folk who had climbed a mountain to ask. The knowledge was there in the warm stone and the clean flue and the careful wall for anyone with the humbleness to come and look. And they were coming, at the last, to look. The invitation came on a soft afternoon when the first green was beginning to show in the low places of the valley. A small group came up the trail together. The sheriff was among them, the man named Reed, who had been the first in all the valley to look up at the ribbon of smoke and let himself doubt the easy story. And with him came 2 or 3 of the older women of the town, the kind of women who hold the true weight of a place in their hands, who decide in the end who belongs and who does not. They had brought a thing the girl had wanted once, more than she would have said aloud. They had brought a welcome. There was a room, one of the women told her, down in the town, a good dry room with a real stove and a real window, in a house with kind people in it. The girl need not pass another winter alone up on a cold mountain. She had proven whatever it was she had set out to prove. She had earned a place among them now. She could come down. She could come in out of the cold and be one of them and belong. It was the very thing. The thing the gate had closed against on the morning a life ended behind her. The thing the woman with the voice like a frozen pond had told her the world held no room for. The thing she had walked into a strange town carrying nothing but a dog and $3 and a quiet, stubborn refusal to die when she was told to. A place, a welcome, to belong. The girl was quiet a long moment. She looked down the long slope at the valley, green now at its edges, with the smoke of its chimneys rising soft into a sky that had, at last, stopped trying to kill everything beneath it. She looked at the women's faces, which were kind now, truly kind, in a way they had not been on a dusty summer street a lifetime ago. And then she looked back, over her shoulder, into the warm, dark mouth of the shelter, at the fire she had built, at the stone that held the sun, at the dog asleep on the warm floor, easy and untroubled, in a place where he had no fear and no want. And she shook her head, gentle. "Thank you kindly," she said. And she meant it, in a way she had not been able to mean such words before. but I'll stay." The women did not understand it at first. The girl could see that. To them it made no sense at all. To choose a hole in a cold mountain over a warm room in a town that had, at last, opened its arms. But the sheriff, the man named Reed, who had a daughter near her age and had watched the smoke through a long winter, he understood it. She had not climbed that mountain to escape the town. She had climbed it to make a thing that was hers. And she had made it. This stone, this fire, this warmth wrought out of patience and a dead man's gift. This was the first place in all her life that had ever truly belonged to her. The town had not given it. The town could not now take its place. For the first time, she had a home. And a person does not leave a home they have bled to build, even for the comfort of a welcome that comes a season too late. The town had counted her out, and then the town had come, at the last, to her door. And now the town would have to go on climbing the trail, because she was not coming down off her mountain. She was, instead, the reason they had begun to build a path up it. The Mercer family came up the trail together on a bright morning, not long after the thaw had truly set in. They did not come with questions, the way the farmer and the millers had come. They did not come with a welcome, the way the women had come. They came with a gift. The father carried a heavy sack of flour upon his shoulder, up the whole long climb, without once setting it down to rest. And beside him, walking on her own two strong legs, with the high color of the living back in her cheeks, and not a trace of the gray of that terrible night left in her, walked the child, the small girl with the smudge of flour upon her cheek, the one who had left bread and flowers tied with blue wool on a cold stone, the one the wind had carried down to the slack water of the mountain, and the one a girl had gone out into the storm to carry home, whole, healed, walking up the mountain in the spring light as though she had been born to climb it. They set the sack of flour down by her door. The father straightened and he looked at the girl, and his mouth worked the way it had worked on the night he fell across her threshold. A man with far too much in his heart, and no words large enough to carry it. He did not find the words. He did not need them. The flour, carried up a mountain on a father's back, said the thing that words would only have made smaller. And the child crossed the few steps to where the girl stood and looked up at her, the way she had looked up once on a dusty summer street, and she smiled, not the quick, shy sparrow smile this time, there and gone, a real one, a wide one, the smile of a child who knows, in the simple, sure way that children know things, exactly who it was that came for her in the dark. The girl knelt down on the warm stone so that her eyes were level with the child's, and she did a thing she had not done in a long, long while. She smiled back. The child came up the mountain often after that. She would climb the trail, sure-footed each time, with the first new plank and then the second and the third laid down across the muddy places by hands the girl never quite saw. And she would sit beside the girl at the mouth of the shelter in the warm sun, with the dog stretched out between them, and the girl began to teach her, not lessons the way they were given in gray buildings, not rules to be memorized and recited back. She taught the child the way her own father had once taught her, by sitting beside her, by pointing. She showed her how to tie a thread of pale wool to a stick and wedge it into a crack in the stone and watch the way it moved. She showed her how the wind came down off the heights and ran up and over the rock, and how a body could read where it wanted to go if a body would only sit still long enough to watch. "You watch the thing first," the girl told the child, in words that were not quite her own, in words handed down to her across a long, cold distance by a man with scarred and patient hands. "You watch it a good long while before you ever lift a tool to it. Most folks are in too much of a hurry to sit and watch. That's the whole of their trouble." The child listened. The child watched the thread of wool move in the wind, and something that had been given to a small girl long ago, beside a man building crossings over water, something that had near been lost in a gray building and a cold season and a hole in a mountain, was handed on. It would not be lost now. It had found another small pair of eyes to live behind. The old man stayed. He did not come to live in the shelter. That was hers, and he understood it was hers better than any other soul. But there was another fold in the mountain across the way, where a smaller overhang faced the morning sun, and there, with a quietness that asked nothing of anyone, the old man named Amos made himself a place, a small fire of his own, a patch of ground, a pair of folk who had each in their turn been turned out by the world below, now living within sight of one another's smoke on the high ridge. They did not speak much, the girl and the old man. Neither one of them had much use for speaking, and there was little that wanted saying. But of an evening, the girl would look across the fold of the mountain and see the thin, clean ribbon of his smoke rising into the dusk, the way he could look across and see hers. And it was enough to not be the one alone fire on a dark mountain, to know that the warmth she had built had not only kept her own self alive, but had drawn back to the high places a man who had given up on the company of his own kind. The two of them, the outlaw and the orphan, the two souls the town had once been so glad to be rid of. They were not glad together, exactly. Gladness was a thing neither of them wore easily, but they were not alone. And for two people who had each been left with nothing, that was its own kind of spring. Down in the town, the knowing spread. It did not spread the way a sermon spreads, preached down from a height. It spread the way a seed spreads on the wind, taking root quiet in the fertile ground that a hard winter leaves behind it. It spread in the way a man now looked at a south-facing hill and saw not just a slope, but a thing that might hold the warmth of the sun. It spread in the way a woman now set a smooth, flat stone close beside her cook stove to warm through the day, so that come the cold of the night she might wrap it in wool and tuck it down at the foot of a child's bed. It spread in the wall a farmer built across the windward side of a new barn, dry stacked, no mortar, set just so to turn the wind aside. No one stood up to call it the girl's wisdom. No one needed to. The knowing simply moved through the valley, hand to hand, hearth to hearth, the way the truly useful things have a way of moving, quietly, and for good. And Walter Crane. Walter Crane was seen the following week frowning over the great iron stove in his own warm store, the big, inefficient box that ate wood by the armload and gave back precious little warmth for the eating. He was seen with a string and a small weight, studying the angle of its flue. A man teaching himself, late, a thing a girl had known all along. He never did speak of the night on the mountain. He never did say to her face that he had been wrong, but the chalkboard by the stove stayed clean. The cruel words never went back up on it. And when a stranger passing through the town spoke slighting of the strange girl who lived up on Crowbone Ridge, it was Walter Crane, of all the men in that valley, who set his jaw and looked up from his counter and said, low and flat, "You'll speak of her with respect in here, or you'll speak of her somewhere else." A man does not always need the word sorry. Sometimes the way he sets his jaw between you and a careless stranger says it louder than the word ever could. The girl was at the mouth of her shelter on a soft gold evening near the close of that first long year, when the whole of it settled over her at once. She had earned, by then, enough from the herbs she sold and the pelts she tanned to buy 2 small panes of real glass from a peddler passing through. She had set them careful in a frame of wood and sealed them with her clay, and replaced the cloudy oilcloth that had served her window through the winter. And now, for the first time, she could sit inside her warm home, sheltered from whatever weather chose to come, and see clearly down the long slope to the valley below. The lamps were coming on, down there, in the windows of the town, soft and gold, one by one, in the gathering dusk. A town that had bet on the day she would die. A town that climbed her mountain now, on a path it was building plank by plank, to ask her how a thing was done. The dog lay stretched across the warm stone of the ledge, in the last of the day's heat held in the rock, his amber eyes half closed, easy and untroubled, in a place where he had no fear and no want. And the girl sat in her doorway, in her home, the first thing that had ever truly been hers, and she thought of the words a woman had spoken to her on a morning that felt now like another life. Make your own way, or wither. The world keeps no room for soft hearts. The woman had meant it as a sentence, a door closing. A small, cruel truth handed to a girl with $9 to carry like a stone down the long road into the dark. And the girl had taken those hard words, and she had turned them clean inside out. She had made her own way, that much was so, but she had not withered, and the world, against everything that woman had told her, had turned out to have a room in it after all. Not a room handed to her out of charity, not a cot earned with 16 hours of labor and the duty of being grateful. A room she had carved, with her own 2 ruined and healed and stubborn hands, out of the cold heart of a mountain that the whole world had told her would be her grave. And it had not been her grave. It had been her home. The first snow of the next season was a long way off yet. The summer lay ahead, green and warm and forgiving. And there was work to be done in it. Wood to gather, walls to mend, herbs to dry, a child to teach the reading of the wind. But she was not afraid of the cold that would come, in its time, the way the cold always comes to that high country. Let it come. She knew the mountain now. She knew the sun and the stone and the wind that goes over and not through. She knew how to draw the warmth out of the day and hold it against the dark of the night. And more than the knowing of stone and fire, she knew now a thing she had not known on the morning the gate closed behind her, that a girl left with nothing could build, out of patience and stone and the quiet gift of a man long gone, a thing far greater than a shelter. She could build a place to belong. The dog let out a long, contented breath on the warm stone. The lamps glowed soft in the valley below, and the thin, clean ribbon of smoke rose steady from the high stone chimney into the deepening blue of the evening sky. The way it had risen all along, through the worst of the dark, and into the light on the far side of it. A quiet, patient, stubborn signal sent up from the high ridge. That a soul the world had thrown away had not been thrown away after all. That she had made her own way, and that she had, at the last, come home.